Hey guys, today is Monday, August 17th, 2026. My name is Tony. This is my podcast, and welcome to it. Every generation eventually looks at those coming up behind them, shakes their heads, and asks the same question. What is wrong with kids today? They don't go outside. They don't know how to entertain themselves. They can't handle setbacks. They need constant reassurance. They're glued to screens. They don't take risks and they don't seem nearly as independent as we were at their age. And I've complained about some of this myself. The problem is that the more I think about it, the less convinced I am that there's anything particularly wrong with the kids. I think we broke childhood, not intentionally. In fact, I think we probably did it while trying to make childhood better. We made it safer. We made it more structured. We got better at supervising kids. We became more aware of all the terrible things that could happen to them. And we tried to prevent as many of those things as possible. And those all sound like good things. I'm just not sure we ever stopped to ask what the kids were learning from the things we took away from them. When I was a kid, my friends and I had a lot of unsupervised time. There was just one pretty universal rule back then. Have fun and come back when the streetlights come on. And that was about it. We didn't leave the house with snacks and water bottles and a detailed itinerary. Nobody had a phone. Nobody could track us on an app. Our parents had no idea exactly where we were most of the time. We left, and then for the rest of the day, whatever happened was basically our problem. Sometimes we got hungry and we ignored a growling tummy. Sometimes we got thirsty and drank from a hose. Sometimes somebody got hurt and we had to patch ourselves up. And sometimes you needed to take a shit and there wasn't a bathroom anywhere nearby. So you figured it out. I don't remember anybody saying we need a grown up. More importantly, I don't remember the grown-ups being thrilled on the odd time we interrupted to solve something we could have solved without them. So we learned to solve things ourselves. And that sounds irresponsible by today's standards. And maybe some of it was. My friends and I once managed to pry the lid off a manhole, and we spent an entire day exploring the storm sewers underneath Calgary. That is not something I would recommend. That is not an example of the good old days. That's an example of kids being fucking idiots. We could have been seriously injured. We could have even been killed. So I'm not interested in pretending everything we did was secretly good for us just because we survived it. Some things were just plain dangerous, but most of our childhood wasn't spent exploring storm sewers. It was spent making hundreds of much smaller decisions without an adult standing beside us. Can I climb that? Can I jump from here? How fast can I go down this hill? Can I get across there? Should I follow my friends? Am I actually capable of doing this thing I'm about to do? Sometimes the answer was yes. And sometimes the answer was very clearly no. And I discovered that about 3 seconds after committing to it. Those lessons stuck. Lessons I learned the hard way have always stuck with me. And somewhere inside all of those stupid decisions, I learned something about risk. I learned that risk and danger aren't the same thing. I learned that something can be dangerous and still worth doing. I learned that sometimes the possible reward isn't remotely worth what I'm risking. I learned to take an honest inventory of my own abilities. Most importantly, I learned that safety isn't guaranteed. You assess the situation, you decide what you're capable of, you make a choice. Then you live with what happens. That's adulthood. Living a real life isn't without risk. Driving is risky. Changing careers is risky. Moving somewhere new is risky. Starting a business is risky. Falling in love is risky. Trusting somebody is risky. Standing up for yourself is risky. You can't build an adult life where everything is guaranteed to be safe. The best you can do is learn how to assess the risk and then decide which risks are worth taking. I think childhood used to give us a lot more opportunities to practice that. Conflict worked the same way. I experienced both versions when I was growing up. Sometimes adults got involved in conflicts between kids. It usually stopped whatever was happening in the moment. What it didn't necessarily do was resolve anything. Sometimes I'd wait and get the other kid later, and sometimes we'd avoid each other afterward until things got super awkward. Sometimes other kids took sides and circles of friends just fragmented. Sometimes a friendship that probably could have survived the original fight never recovered from everything that happened after the adult stepped in. When we settled things ourselves, it wasn't always pretty either. Sometimes there were strong words. Sometimes somebody got their ass kicked. And I'm not going to romanticize that either, but something interesting usually happened. The pressure got released. Whatever needed to be said got said. And whatever the conflict was actually about had to be dealt with because there was nobody else there to deal with it for us. Then, surprisingly often, we moved forward as friends. I'm not arguing that adults should never intervene when kids are fighting. Of course, they should sometimes. I'm just wondering what happens when they always do. If someone steps in every time there's a conflict, then when exactly does a kid learn how to navigate it? If someone manages every disagreement for you, when do you discover that you're capable of handling yourself? Even exploring places we weren't supposed to go taught me things. The world seemed enormous when I was a kid. You didn't have to leave your neighborhood for it to feel that way. There were alleys and fields and construction sites and wooded areas and buildings and places we knew damn well we weren't supposed to be. So naturally, we went there. Sometimes what I discovered was that my parents were right. There was a reason we weren't supposed to be there. That's another part of this that I think gets missed. Breaking the rules didn't always teach me that rules were stupid. Sometimes breaking the rule taught me exactly why the rule existed. My parents could tell me something was dangerous, but going there and discovering the danger for myself gave their warning credibility. That's a lesson too. We often asked forgiveness instead of permission. Actually, that's pretty generous. Most of the time, we didn't ask either unless we got caught. And I think kids and parents could probably benefit from a little bit more of that now because some decisions can't really teach you anything if somebody else has already made the decision for you. You have to assess the situation yourself. You have to occasionally be wrong. And you have to discover where your limits actually are. That's where confidence comes from. And I think we've confused two very different kinds of confidence. There's the confidence of knowing that somebody will always be there to help you. Then there's the confidence of knowing that you can handle your own shit. And those aren't the same thing. I saw a lot of parents desperately trying to protect their children's confidence. They wanted their kids to feel capable. They wanted them to feel safe. They wanted them to know somebody would always be nearby if anything went wrong. And I understand that instinct. But knowing someone else can handle the problem isn't the same as knowing you can. Real confidence has receipts. It's remembering all the times you were scared and did it anyway. All the times something went wrong and you figured it out. All the times you got lost and found your way back. All the fights you worked through. All the mistakes you survived. All of the stupid ideas that taught you not to try that particular stupid idea again. Eventually, you accumulate enough of those experiences that when something goes wrong, your first thought isn't necessarily, who's going to help me? It's, I'll figure it out. I tried to give my own kids as much of that freedom as I could, but the problem was that the world around them had changed. I could give them permission to go outside, but I couldn't recreate the neighborhood I grew up in. When everyone's kids were outside, everybody had an incentive to occasionally look out the window. Your parents weren't necessarily watching you, but somebody was around. There were other kids everywhere. There were adults scattered throughout the neighborhood who had at least some idea of what was happening. It wasn't formal supervision. Nobody was organizing it. It was just part of having a neighborhood full of children who were constantly moving through it. And as fewer kids were allowed to roam, that system started disappearing. There were fewer kids outside. Adults had less reason to pay attention to what was happening outside. People had more distractions. Some people decided that somebody else's kid wasn't their business. Eventually, giving your kid the freedom we had didn't necessarily recreate what we had. You could give them the freedom and send them outside. There just might not be anybody out there. And I think that's important because it's very easy to blame individual parents for all of this. And I'm not interested in doing that. The environment changed and parenting changed with it. Technology changed, communities changed, our understanding of risk changed, and devices entered the picture somewhere in the middle of all of it. I don't know how much screens caused the disappearance of independent childhood and how much they just filled the vacuum after it started disappearing. Probably a little of both. What I do know is that a lot of kids don't seem to know how to have fun without a device, a show, or a structured activity. And I don't think the problem is just that screens are too entertaining. I think kids lost the time and space where they would have learned what to do without them. We complain that kids don't go outside. Okay, go outside and do what? Where are the other kids? Where are they allowed to go? What are they allowed to do when they get there? How far can they wander? What can they climb? What happens when somebody gets hurt? What happens when they argue? How long before an adult gets involved? We've taken something that used to be open-ended and turned it into a series of managed activities. School is structured, sports are structured, lessons are structured, play dates are structured, entertainment comes prepackaged. Even a lot of play happens in environments designed around keeping everybody within a clearly defined boundary. Then we look at kids who grew up inside that system and we wonder why they don't seem comfortable operating without structure. Why would they? Where were they supposed to learn it? And that's why I keep coming back to those streetlights. Come home when the streetlights come on sounds like a rule about time, but it wasn't. It was a rule about trust. Between leaving the house and those lights coming on, we were expected to handle pretty much everything. Not perfectly, definitely not safely every single time, certainly not intelligently. We were kids. The whole point was that we didn't know what we were doing yet. We were learning, and learning occasionally hurts. There's nothing inherently catastrophic about bumps and scrapes, and I'm not particularly horrified by the possibility that a kid might even break a bone. Obviously there are risks that aren't worth taking. Head trauma isn't a valuable childhood lesson, and death isn't character building. I'm not going to draw some universal line and tell parents which risks their kids should be allowed to take because every child is different. Every parent knows things about their kid that I don't. That's their job to figure out. I just think that we've moved the line so far toward preventing anything bad from happening that we've also prevented a lot of learning from happening. We solved real problems and then we kept solving. We made playgrounds safer. We supervised more closely. We structured more of the children's time. We became more involved in their friendships. We gave them ways to contact us instantly. We found ways to know where they were. We tried to eliminate danger. And somewhere along the way, I think we started treating risk like a childhood defect. Then those kids became teenagers and young adults, and suddenly we're confused that they aren't eager to take risks. We're surprised when they don't know what to do without instructions. We're frustrated that they want somebody else nearby when something goes wrong. We're disappointed that they don't have confidence in their ability to handle unfamiliar situations. Where exactly were they supposed to get that confidence? Confidence isn't something you can hand somebody. It's something they accumulate. You accumulate it by handling things, sometimes badly, sometimes painfully, sometimes in ways that make a great story 30 years later, sometimes in ways you're lucky enough to survive and smart enough never to repeat. That's what worries me about the version of childhood we've created. Not that kids are different from us. Of course, they're different from us. We gave them a completely different childhood. What worries me is that childhood is supposed to prepare you for something. Eventually, the supervision ends. Eventually, nobody is organizing the activity. And eventually, there's no parent standing nearby. Eventually, you encounter a problem or nobody knows the answer. Eventually, life puts you somewhere that isn't safe. And then what? I don't want to go back to a world where kids spend the afternoon crawling through storm sewers. Some of that shit we did was genuinely insane. I just don't think that the alternative had to be a childhood where every meaningful risk gets removed before the kid ever has a chance to evaluate it. There has to be some room between neglect and constant supervision, some room to wander, some room to screw up, some room to get hurt, some room to have a fight and work it out, some room to discover that your parents were right, some room to discover that your parents were wrong, some room to make a decision nobody approved beforehand, some room to find out that you can actually handle way more than anybody realized, because childhood isn't supposed to be perfectly safe, and neither is adulthood. Maybe one of the most important things child can teach us is how to live anyway.